They said she bewitched him. But perhaps it was worse than that. Perhaps she convinced him he was not just a man but a god, and that God himself wanted him to rewrite history with her in his bed and England at his feet. When Anne Boleyn first stepped into Henry's gaze, she did not wear a crown. Only a look of fierce calculation disguised as flirtation. And when she smiled, England did not know it was beginning to fall apart one heartbeat at a time. He tore down 1,000 years of faith for her, excommunicated himself from the Pope, defied the Holy Roman Empire, ruined a queen, beloved by the people, and scorched the path between kingship and sanctity until it was ash. All because Anne Boleyn made him feel like God would forgive anything done in the name of love. But love has a price, and power has a greater one. And when the crown finally touched her dark hair in the year 1533, it was already heavy with whispers and enemies. And far in the distance, a French sword was being polished for a neck that still laughed and did not yet know it would bleed. She did not rise alone, and that was her first mistake. Thomas Cromwell, the son of a blacksmith who taught himself law and clawed his way through the court like a ghost in the walls, had been Anne's unlikely partner in this revolution. Where she brought fire, he brought steel. Where she brought ambition, he brought machinery. Together they built the road to Henry's second marriage, paved with reformist faith and political warfare. Cromwell, who knew Henry longed to escape, Catherine of Aragon, and Anne, who longed to be more than a mistress, joined hands, not in love or friendship, but in convenience. And for a while, their alliance was unshakable. But alliances built on ambition are never made to last. For ambition has no memory, no loyalty, and no pity. By the year 1536, what had begun as a triumphant union was unraveling thread by thread. Anne had failed to deliver the son Henry needed, and every miscarriage etched her doom deeper into the stone walls of the palace. On the 29th day of January, the same day her old rival, Catherine of Aragon, was lowered into the ground. Anne lost a baby that might have been a boy 14 weeks formed and shaped. A mild child, perhaps. And in that small, tragic body lay the last hope of redemption. Henry, who believed his second marriage was supposed to be blessed by heaven, now saw it cursed. And Anne, once the light of his obsession, became a storm cloud hanging over the future of the Tudor line. It is not clear whether Henry gave the order, but Cromwell understood what was expected of him. Anne had outlived her usefulness, and more dangerously, she had turned her rage toward Cromwell himself. There were public arguments, fierce and cutting, and Anne was not the type to whisper when she could wound. According to the imperial ambassador, Eustace Chapuis, Anne once told Cromwell she would like to see his head off his shoulders. And though Cromwell smiled in public, he knew better than anyone how fast the wheel of fortune turned in Henry's court. The woman who had destroyed Cardinal Wolsey could destroy him too. And so he made a decision not to survive her, but to erase her. Her downfall began not with blood, but with a sermon. On Passion Sunday, Anne ordered her almoner, John Skip, to deliver a fiery message before the king and court, denouncing evil counsellors who diverted royal wealth and tempted kings to ignoble actions. The target was clear: Cromwell, who had diverted riches from dissolved monasteries into the royal treasury, sat and listened as the Queen compared him to Haman, the enemy of Queen Esther, the man who built a scaffold for others and ended up hanging on it himself. Cromwell, humiliated and cornered, moved quickly. He aligned himself with men who once despised him, conservative courtiers like Sir Nicholas Carew and the Seymour brothers, enemies of Anne, who now offered Cromwell a way out. Together they formed a conspiracy not just to remove a queen, but to destroy a woman whose voice had become too loud and too dangerous. By the 21st day of April, a private humiliation delivered by Henry pushed Cromwell over the edge. The king scolded him for favouring an imperial alliance, something Anne had always opposed. Cromwell believed she had poisoned the king's mind against him. That night, Cromwell vanished from court for a week, claiming illness. But in truth, he was plotting a trial that would appear legal and holy, but would be soaked in lies and whispers. He could not seek a divorce. The people would not tolerate another. He could not claim invalidity. Anne had been crowned. Blessed. Accepted. No. He needed more than failure. He needed filth. He needed sin. He needed treason. And Anne, bold and flirtatious, gave him just enough to build a noose from it. She had always surrounded herself with men. Her brother George, Viscount Rochford, witty and clever, Mark Smeaton, the court musician with soft hands and softer eyes, Henry Norris, the groom of the stool, a man close to Henry's own heart, Francis Weston, young and charming, William Brereton, powerful and inconvenient. Cromwell twisted their loyalty into lust, their presence into proof, and when the stories weren't damning enough, he made them worse. Mark Smeaton, arrested first, was likely tortured into confessing a lie that named others. Cromwell delivered the confession to Henry, and the king, now certain that God himself was punishing him again, ordered silence, secrecy, and death. On May Day, as the court celebrated with tournaments at Greenwich, Henry watched the festivities, pretending nothing was wrong. Then a whisper reached him, and suddenly he left, quietly, swiftly, with Norris at his side. By nightfall, the Queen's lovers were in chains, and Cromwell had already blocked all access to the king. No one could speak for her. No one could plead. When they came for Anne on the 2nd of May, she laughed at first. She thought it a mistake. She was still queen, but Cromwell himself saw her to the Tower. And when the gates closed behind her, she knew the crown she had fought for had become the blade that would end her. And that was only the beginning. It was winter when the whisper of God's wrath returned to the court. And for Anne Boleyn, it came not in thunder or fire, but in silence that grew like mould across the stone corridors. In glances exchanged between men she once commanded, in footsteps that now paused outside her door too long, and in the way her husband, the King of England, began to look past her with the eyes of a man already speaking to another woman inside his mind. The year was 1536, and the Queen was pregnant again, holding in her belly not only her last chance to save herself, but the trembling hope of a son who could stitch back together a marriage already torn by ghosts, miscarriages, and ambition. But the child would never see the light, and the blood she shed on that cold morning in January would soak more than the linen sheets it would spread to every corner of the palace, touching crown and court, enemy and ally, until it pooled like prophecy beneath her feet. They said she stumbled. They said she wept. They said the king had ridden away when he heard the child was lost. And though Anne had bled before, this one was different, not only because she was further along, not only because the child appeared male and nearly whole, but because on the same day, her greatest enemy had finally been laid to rest. Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife and Anne's eternal rival, had died in Kimbolton Castle, buried quietly, and without the crown she once wore, but still beloved by the people, still remembered as a true queen. And Anne knew, with the dread of a woman whose place had never been secure, that this was no coincidence. God, some whispered, had not blessed Anne's womb, because he had never blessed her marriage. And though Henry once tore down the world to place that crown upon her head, he now looked at her as if it had always belonged to someone else. That very night, when the blood had dried and the sobs had become prayers, Anne sat alone, hollow and watchful, and said to the air, He will not forgive me this time. She was right, but it was not Henry's forgiveness she needed. It was time, and she no longer had it. The court, like wolves circling a bleeding stag, sensed the weakness, and among them, none moved faster or more precisely than Thomas Cromwell. He had been quiet of late, a shadow behind the throne, watching Anne's fire rage with decreasing warmth, measuring the weight of her defiance, and noting, always, the enemies she made with every glance, every gesture, every word. Their alliance had long since rotted, and where once she had praised him, now she mocked him, insulted him in full view of foreign ambassadors, called him greedy, accused him of stealing the gold torn from monasteries, and lining his pockets with the coins meant for the poor. She used the pulpit as her weapon, and commanded her almoner, John Skipp, to preach before the court on Passion Sunday, a sermon dressed in the language of Scripture but sharpened like a dagger, naming no names, but striking one man so clearly that even the unlettered servants knew who was being condemned. The chapel was full that morning, every noble in attendance, and even the king sat still, as Skipp described the dangers of evil counsellors, men who whispered treason into royal ears, who seized holy wealth for ungodly ends, who bent the will of kings to ruin the innocent. The story of Queen Esther and the villain Haman was told with trembling intensity, and though no one dared speak Cromwell's name aloud, the image was clear he was the Haman. And Anne, she was Esther, the queen defending her people, her faith, her honour. But Haman had built a scaffold for another and died upon it himself. And when Cromwell left the chapel that day, pale and silent, he already knew what must be done. She had declared war in the house of God. Now he would answer it in blood. But Cromwell was too clever to strike in rage, too measured to act before the ground was fully prepared. He needed not only motive, but proof. Not only whispers, but names. Anne, in her pride, gave them to him. She had always been bold, always drawn to clever men, to musicians, to scholars, to those who praised her mind and flirted with her across the chessboard of courtly life. She thought herself untouchable, protected by her crown and her wit, and so she allowed them close. Henry Norris, loyal and soft-spoken; Francis Weston, brash and handsome; William Brereton, difficult and powerful; and worst of all, her brother George, with whom her closeness had always made the court uncomfortable. She laughed with them, debated with them, gifted them favours and conversation. And in that dangerous game of courtly love, where glances could be misread and kindness turned into scandal, she forgot that there were men paid to watch, paid to twist, paid to whisper in Cromwell's ear. He placed spies in her chambers, bribed or threatened her ladies, sifted through every harmless comment, every joke, every rumour, until he had enough shadows to convince the king that there was a monster in his bed. But one confession would not be enough. Cromwell needed something more concrete, something signed. He found it in the weakest link, Mark Smeaton, the court musician, young, eager, and easily broken. He was taken quietly, questioned roughly, and though the record is silent on what torments he endured, by the time Cromwell was done with him, Mark had confessed to sleeping with the Queen and had named others. The paper was signed, the sword was drawn. All that remained was the king. Henry did not weep. He did not rage. Instead, he smiled, as if the world had finally confirmed what his heart already knew, that Anne had betrayed him, that the miscarriage had been God's punishment, that her womb was cursed, her soul black, her eyes liars. He gave Cromwell permission to proceed. He said nothing to Anne. The next morning, he rode out to the May Day tournament, as if the future were still his. Watching the jousts with his usual indulgence, and when Norris passed him on horseback, Henry clapped. Then a note came, a whisper, and the king left the field without a word, taking Norris with him, riding for London, not as a husband or a friend, but as a judge. By nightfall, Norris was in the Tower. Anne still knew nothing. Smeaton had vanished, and she, recovering from her miscarriage, was preparing for a return to court, still believing she had time, still unaware that the very man who had once helped her rise now held the key to her prison. Cromwell moved swiftly. He blocked access to the king. He made lists. He summoned soldiers. On the 2nd day of May, Anne was arrested. She laughed. She asked if it were a jest. When they said it was not, her face did not fall, only her breath. She walked to the Tower with her head held high, and beside her rode Cromwell. That night, alone in the cold stone room, she wrote Henry a letter. In it, she reminded him of their love, of his oaths, of her innocence. She called him unprincely, cruel, said. She prayed God would forgive the great sin being done against her. She never knew if the letter was read. Cromwell may have kept it. He had no use for poetry. Only confession. And confession he would get, whether it was true or not. And outside, beneath her window, the crows had begun to gather. There are moments in history where silence is not absence but architecture, where what is not said becomes the scaffolding for what is destroyed. In the final weeks of Anne Boleyn's life, it was silence that wove the net around her, and it was silence that pulled tight each knot, binding her to crimes no one saw, to lovers no one could truly name, and to a kind of betrayal that had more to do with pride and politics than with lust or love. But the men who fell with her would not be remembered as enemies or traitors or even lovers. They would be remembered as symbols, each one, a mirror reflecting some part of Anne's fall. Their bodies flung into the river of history to prove that she had drowned. It began with music. Mark Smeaton, the handsome young musician of the royal court, whose voice could still a room, and whose presence was more ornamental than political, became the first to be caught in Cromwell's snare. He played the lute and sang in Queen Anne's chambers, as so many did, but he did not belong to her inner circle of noble-born courtiers. That made him vulnerable. That made him expendable. When he disappeared, few noticed. When he confessed, no one heard his screams. They said he admitted to lying with the Queen 3 separate times, and they said he did so without torture. But no one who understood Cromwell believed that. The words he signed were not music, and they did not sound like truth. They sounded like death. His name was written first, but his fate was never his own. He was simply the opening note in a dirge Anne did not yet know was being composed. Next came Henry Norris, groom of the stool, trusted servant, a man so close to the king that few rooms existed where he was not allowed to follow. He had once been a favourite of Anne's too, and their flirtations had the tone of old familiarity rather than passion, the kind of easy banter born of proximity, not desire. But Norris was respected. And worse, he was loyal not to Cromwell, not to the Seymours, not to the factions that schemed beneath the tapestries, but to the king himself. That made him dangerous. He would not help destroy Anne, but neither would he betray his master. When the accusation came, he refused to confess. Even when the king himself offered him a pardon in exchange for a plea of guilt, Norris refused. He stood silent, and for that, Cromwell ensured he would never speak again. His name followed Smeaton's on the scroll of doom, and his place in the Tower was secured. Then came George Boleyn, Anne's brother, the Viscount Rochford. He was not just a courtier or a nobleman, he was a Boleyn, born from the same ambitious blood that had carried Anne to the throne. and to those who watched them together, who saw the private glances, the jokes no one else understood, the closeness that lingered in the air long after they parted, it was enough. Enough to imagine, enough to accuse. Cromwell needed not only adultery but perversion, not only betrayal, but incest. The accusation was so grotesque that even those who hated Anne hesitated. But Cromwell was not building a case for truth. He was building a case for finality. George was called to the Tower and interrogated. He gave no confessions. He held his ground. But the charges were set, and once the machinery was in motion, no innocence could stop it. Francis Weston and William Brereton were next. Weston, young and bold, had been careless with his words, joking once that Norris visited the Queen too often. That was enough. Brereton, powerful in the north, had blocked Cromwell's reforms in Wales and among the Marcher lordships. That was worse. Both were men with connections, titles, land, influence. Both were obstacles. Now both were enemies of the crown, because they had once stood too close to a queen who had lost her protector, Anne, in her cell in the Tower. He was surrounded by women she had not chosen, planted there to spy and report every sob, every whisper, every word that might be twisted into guilt. She was not told who had been arrested. She asked. They would not answer. She guessed. She was usually correct. At times she laughed, and then wept. Her mind, sharp as it had ever been, could see the pattern forming. You could see the charges being sewn together like a dress she was never meant to wear. She asked if the king had spoken of her. No one replied. She asked if he had read her letter. There was only silence. She had miscarried a son, and now she was accused of carrying men. She was interrogated. She was told of the accusations of Mark, of Norris, of George. When they spoke of George, she froze. When they described the charges, she grew pale and said only, "Oh, my mother." She denied everything, calmly, with dignity. But Cromwell had already arranged the theatre. He had ensured the stage was set, the audience ready. When the trials began, evidence was read aloud. Evidence so salacious, so crude, that the truth of it no longer mattered. They said she had kissed her brother, tongue to tongue. They said she had taken Norris to her bed within weeks of giving birth to Elizabeth. They said her lust had corrupted every man she smiled at. And through it all, she sat still, regal, silent, listening to the world she built turn to ash. When it was George's turn to stand trial, he faced not only treason, but the unthinkable. He defended himself with eloquence, spoke plainly and with fire, even when he was told that one of the charges had been redacted because it implied impotence in the king himself. George smiled. The courtroom laughed nervously. But he was not spared. On the 15th day of May, both siblings were condemned. High treason, incest, adultery. The penalty was death. The court, bloated with lies and politics, delivered its verdict, not as law, but as performance. Each sentence already written before the curtain rose. Anne, upon hearing her fate, said she had thought to be judged only by God, not by men who already hated her. In the Tower, she crumbled only briefly. Then she prayed. She asked if her daughter would be safe. No one answered. She asked if Henry would visit. They said no. She said she would die with dignity, and if allowed, she would wear red. They refused. She chose white, a nun's colour, a virgin's lee, a martyr's shroud. Outside the Tower, the scaffold was being built, and across the channel, the sword was already on its way. The Tower had held queens before, but none like her. Not one who still wore the crown in name, who still signed letters as Queen of England, who still believed, despite everything, that truth might be louder than treason. But Anne Boleyn was not brought to the Tower to be questioned. She was brought to be erased. And though she sat behind stone walls surrounded by guards and whispers, the performance had already begun outside. Her enemies had written the script, chosen the actors, designed the costumes, and sharpened the blade. All that remained was the performance, and Anne, like it or not, would take centre stage. The courtroom at the Tower of London was not a place for justice that day. It was a theatre carved in stone, wrapped in banners and hushed by expectation. The peers who had been summoned to judge her were not strangers. Many had dined with her. Some had once praised her rise. A few had secretly loved her. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was the silence from the throne. What mattered was the direction of the wind. What mattered was that the king no longer defended her. And when the monarch's favour withdraws, so too does mercy, courage, and memory. Of the 26 men who formed the jury, not one was brave enough to forget what was expected of them. Anne entered, not as a prisoner but as a queen. She wore a gown of black damask and a hood that framed her sharp, pale face. Her posture was still regal. Though her frame had grown thinner, she bowed slightly to the court, then stood tall. Her chin did not tremble. Her hands did not shake. When the charges were read aloud, she did not cry. She listened as they accused her of treason, adultery, and incest. She listened as they described her with words meant to rot words like perverse, insatiable, carnal. They said she had lured men with her beauty, compelled them to betray their king, corrupted the very air around her. They said she had betrayed Henry with 5 men, one of whom was her own brother. They said she had used her power to manipulate, to seduce, to sin. But they were not describing Anne Boleyn. They were describing the Anne they needed to kill. When her turn came to speak, she did not falter. She spoke clearly, with the same voice that had once charmed ambassadors and outwitted bishops. She denied every charge. She reminded the court of her devotion to the king, of her careful behaviour, of her fear of God. She said she would rather lose her life than her honour. She said she was innocent, and those who heard her, even those who had already condemned her in their hearts, would later say she had spoken with wisdom and dignity, that she had carried herself like a queen to the last. But her words were not stones. They could not break the structure already built around her. George Boleyn was tried after her, in the same cold space, before the same quiet men. The charges against him were no less horrifying, and no less absurd. That he had slept with his sister, that he had shared her treason, that he had plotted to overthrow the king. He, too, stood with grace. Though the shock of the accusation burned into his face, he defended himself with wit and clarity, refusing to beg, refusing to pretend. But no one in that room believed they were there for proof. They were there for closure. They were there to fulfill a sentence already whispered into their ears by power itself. When the verdicts came, there was no pause, nor deliberation, no shame. Anne was guilty of all charges. George was guilty. Norris, Smeaton, Breton, Weston guilty. They were sentenced to die. The men by the axe, Anne by the sword. It was as if the courtroom had merely caught up to a fate already decided. As if time itself was simply aligning with a plan that Cromwell had begun weaving in shadows. When Anne was returned to her chamber in the Tower, she laughed. It was not a joyful sound, but a cracked one. A sound that came from somewhere beyond fear. She told her jailers, "I heard the executioner is very good, and I have but a little neck." Then she wrapped her hands around her throat and smiled. It was the smile of a woman who had nothing left to lose, and everything still intact within her. Her dignity, her mind, her refusal to become what they accused her of, Cromwell, meanwhile, had already begun building his future. He wrote letters. He secured appointments. He prepared Gregory, his son, for marriage into the Seymour family. The Queen was not yet dead, but the world had already moved on. Jane Seymour was being dressed for her future, and the King no longer spoke Anne's name. But the people had not yet forgotten. Outside the walls, there were those who still whispered of Anne's intelligence, her courage, her vision. Some believed the charges, but many did not. Many saw the trial for what it was: a performance, a political purge, a necessary illusion to cleanse the king's conscience. Still, none could help her. None would try. The stage was cleared. The act was over, and now the scaffold waited. In the early light of the 19th of May, the sky above the Tower of London was grey, with a silence so deep it felt like an omen. The stones were cold. The river moved sluggishly below. And on Tower Green, the scaffold had been freshly swept. The axe did not lie waiting beside it. There would be no axe. Anne Boleyn, once Queen of England, would die not with the brute finality of a block and blade, but with the elegance of a single stroke from a foreign sword, brought across the sea from Calais, wielded by a man trained to kill so cleanly that the condemned often never knew the moment they ceased to be alive. It was, they said, a mercy. But mercy has many faces, and not all of them are kind. She had known for 3 days that she would die, and in that time, she wept. She prayed. She spoke. She laughed. They said she was mad, but she was not. She was awake. She was bright as glass. She was clearer in those hours than many would ever be in their lives. She asked for a final confession. She asked for a priest. She asked if she could be buried in a plain chest, and if her daughter would be spared. No one answered, or if they did, the answers were in the form of shrugs and downward glances. The tower's stones did not echo with sympathy. They only held secrets. She prepared for death, like she had once prepared for coronation. With precision, with grace, with control, she chose a gown of damask grey, covered by a mantle of crimson, the Tudor colour of martyrdom. She tied her long dark hair beneath a linen coif, so that nothing would interfere with the blade. Her face was pale but composed, and her voice, when she spoke, was soft and steady. She asked her ladies to stop crying. She told them not to grieve for her, that she had been called to a better place, that God would judge her more kindly than men had. Her courage unsettled those sent to watch her, and even Sir William Kingston, the constable of the Tower, admitted in a letter that never had he seen a prisoner behave with more composure. Henry did not come. He had risen early that morning and rode out to hunt. Some said it was tradition. Some said it was cowardice. Others said it was calculation. His new bride, Jane Seymour, was already being fitted for gowns, already being addressed as my lady. He had not waited for the body to grow cold. Perhaps he could not. Perhaps he dared not. Perhaps it was easier to write the ending while already rehearsing the next beginning. The executioner from Calais arrived silently. He brought no axe, only a sword. Slim, deadly, elegant, it had been sharpened with oil and whetstone, and wiped clean. He spoke no English. He bowed to Anne in the French style. She returned the courtesy. They were, in that moment, the only two people on the green who knew precisely what was coming, and exactly what it would take. Just before the final walk, Anne spoke briefly with Kingston again. She thanked him for his kindness. She asked that he deliver a message to the king, though whether it was of love, forgiveness, or qui est damnation, no one ever recorded. She ascended the scaffold steps without aid. The crowd, small and carefully chosen, watched in a reverent hush. No one shouted. No one cheered. Even her enemies understood that they were watching something unrepeatable, a queen preparing to die. Not with guilt, but with clarity. When she reached the platform, she turned and faced them. She did not denounce the king. She did not curse Cromwell. She did not proclaim innocence. Instead, she offered the expected words: loyalty, prayer, love. She said she had been a good wife to the king and begged forgiveness of those she had offended. She did not speak her daughter's name. That name lived silently inside her heart, and perhaps she believed it was safer kept there. Then she knelt. Her ladies stepped forward, eyes red and hands trembling, and gently tied a cloth over her eyes. They wept as they did it. They smoothed her skirts, so she would die with dignity. She reached behind her neck and adjusted the coif herself. "I have a little neck," she said, and laughed. And that was the last thing Anne Boleyn ever said aloud. The executioner asked for his sword, and then, with practiced ease, he called to his assistant, "Bring me my sword." And as Anne turned her head slightly in confusion, expecting movement from one side, he struck from the other. It was over in a single breath. Her head fell, cleanly severed, and her body slumped forward. Blood did not spurt, but poured in a thick, red ribbon across the boards. Her eyes, they said, were still open. There was no coffin prepared, only a rough arrow chest, meant for storing arrows in the Tower armory. They placed her body inside it, with the head beside it, wrapped in linen. The crowd dispersed in silence. Her ladies washed the blood from the scaffold. No bells rang, no prayers were ordered. And the following day, Henry was engaged to Jane Seymour. Thomas Cromwell, who had orchestrated it all, was rewarded handsomely. His son married into the Seymour family. His power grew, his reach extended into every part of the government. But even he, years later, would remember her, and perhaps, though he would never say it aloud, remember the way she faced death as if it were a mirror she had already seen. And in a quiet corner of the Tower, beneath the floor of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the remains of Anne Boleyn were buried. No stone marked her grave for centuries, but her name did not vanish. It lived on, in whispers, in children, in the silence that followed a queen who died, standing. In the days that followed the execution, London did not weep. The bells did not toll. The streets did not grow quiet, and no mourning cloth was hung from palace walls. The court turned its face to the sun, as if it had not just buried a queen. The king, once broken with grief for the death of his mother, once torn with sorrow over the loss of a son, now moved with astonishing speed toward his next chapter. On the very day, Anne Boleyn was buried beneath the floor of the chapel. Henry wore white and ordered new banners to be stitched, not for mourning, but for marriage. It was as though her death had not been the end of something, but a clearing, a purification, a removal of inconvenience. And standing beside him, newly risen and newly rewarded, was the man who had made it all possible, a commoner by birth, a blacksmith's son from Putney, who now found himself closer to the throne than some nobleman had ever dreamed. Thomas Cromwell had always understood the nature of power better than those who were born into it. While dukes and earls relied on bloodlines and ancient privileges, Cromwell had built himself out of nothing, learning languages, counting coin, serving abroad, and returning home not with titles, but with knowledge, and that was worth more than a crest. He had risen through the cracks of the system, first as Wolsey's man, then as the king's, and now, after Anne Boleyn's fall, he stood as the chief architect of a new regime, and the price of that regime had been blood 5 men on the scaffold, one queen without a head, and a nation that no longer knew whether its faith was made of scripture or sword. But Cromwell was not sentimental. He did not mourn Anne. He did not doubt the necessity of what he had done. He believed, with the cold conviction of a man who has seen too much to believe in mercy, that her death was a transaction necessary, efficient, even just. She had threatened him. She had mocked him in front of ambassadors. She had turned the pulpit into a weapon and the king's heart into a battlefield. And Cromwell, above all, understood that to be indispensable to Henry was to be loyal not to people, not to principles, but to outcomes. So he arranged one more outcome, one that would bind him not only to the crown politically, but to it by blood. Jane Seymour had replaced Anne in the king's heart with startling ease. She was everything Anne had not been: quiet, obedient, pious, pliable. She did not interrupt. She did not debate. She smiled. She yielded, and she brought with her a family eager to rise. Among them, her sister Elizabeth Seymour, widowed, respectably, and available. Cromwell proposed a marriage between his son, Gregory, and Elizabeth Seymour, and the offer was accepted without resistance. With that single union, the blacksmith's son became kin to the Queen of England. His bloodline, once dismissed as common, now ran parallel to that of the Tudors. It was not just a marriage, it was a seal, a reward, a symbol. The court whispered about it, but no one dared laugh. Cromwell, once mocked for his origins, was now beyond reach. He had no noble name, but he had noble power, and that mattered more. He bought land, built estates, received titles. He was named Earl of Essex and appointed Lord Great Chamberlain. But titles did not protect in Henry's court. What protected a man was usefulness. And Cromwell remained useful, for now, and yet, even as he grew, even as he tightened his grip on the reins of government, the shadows lengthened around him. The same ruthlessness that had destroyed Anne Boleyn would not sleep quietly. The same factions that once aligned behind him would turn if the wind shifted. The nobles who smiled at his rise had not forgotten who he was, nor would they ever let him forget. He could not erase his father's forge from their memory. He could only build high enough to make them choke on their resentment. But there were days when even Cromwell must have felt the weight of what he had done. The tower remained. The scaffold was still damp with history. He had walked beside Anne when she was queen, bowed before her, written letters in her favour, strategized with her, reformed with her. He had broken England with her, and then, without flinching, broken her too. And now her ghost lingered not in the court, but in the daughter she had left behind, the girl with the sharp eyes and the silent mouth, watching as the world forgot her mother's name. Elizabeth, Anne's daughter, was too young to speak against what had been done, but she would remember, and though Cromwell did not yet fear her, he should have, because history has a longer memory than kings and queens. Even dead ones do not always vanish. There are few things more dangerous than a woman who refuses to vanish. And though Anne Boleyn's body had already been buried in an unmarked grave beneath the cold stone of St. Peter ad Vincula, her voice refused to die quietly. It clung to parchment, inked in her own hand, carried by trembling fingers, and slipped like a ghost into the future. It was a letter written not to her daughter, nor to her God, but to the man who had taken everything from her, to the king, to Henry, to the man who once swore he would move heaven and earth just to call her his wife, and then stood silently as the axe was sharpened for her neck. They found it later, folded among Thomas Cromwell's private papers, marked only with the words, "From the Lady in the Tower." Whether it ever reached the king remains uncertain. Whether Cromwell read it and kept it from him, or whether Henry read it and folded it away with his guilt. Those are the kinds of questions history lets hang like cobwebs. Untouched but heavy. The letter itself was not long. But every word carried the weight of a woman who had nothing left to fear, and nothing left to gain. She wrote, not with the venom of betrayal, but with a clarity born of pain. She reminded Henry of their love, of the promises they made, of the 7 years he pursued her, when he could have had any other. She reminded him that she had never been unfaithful, that her only crime was being too proud, too opinionated, too unwilling to kneel in silence while men made war with her name. She accused no one by name, not even Cromwell, but her language was sharp as any blade. She called his actions unprincely. She said she would meet her death with grace, and she hoped that God would forgive him, even if she could not. It was not the kind of letter that begged for pity. It was the kind that lingered in the back of the mind, like a whisper during prayer. And for those who read it, or heard of it, it burned with the quiet fire of truth, the kind of truth that cannot be rewritten, not even by a king. Yet Henry never spoke of it. Not once. Not to his council. Not to Jane Seymour. Not to his children. The Anne he remembered, if he remembered her at all, was the Anne of his nightmares. Not the Anne who had once laughed with him in secret gardens. Not the Anne who had given him a daughter with her eyes. Not the Anne who had stood in the tower and waited for death like a queen carved from stone. The court understood this silence. It was the kind of silence that dared no one to speak her name. The kind of silence that kings wrap themselves in when guilt becomes too sharp to bear. But not everyone forgot. There were those who watched, those who waited. Elizabeth, though only a child, never forgot the face of her mother. The silence that followed her execution became a language of its own, and Elizabeth learned to speak it fluently. She learned that to survive in a court that killed queens, one must never blink, one must never cry, one must never look back. And somewhere deep in the tower, Anne's presence lingered, not as a ghost with chains or moans, but as a quiet weight in the very stones. The guards whispered of dreams. The maids spoke of cold draughts and footsteps in rooms that should have been empty. Even Sir William Kingston, hardened by duty, once remarked in private letters that the Queen had left something behind, a stillness that would not lift. And among the papers Cromwell kept in locked drawers, the letter remained, folded and unread, or perhaps read too often, each time with less certainty that he had done the right thing. Because even Cromwell, for all his logic and law, you must have understood that something sacred had been broken, that the trial he had built, the case he had woven, had not been truth, but necessity, that Anne had died not because she was guilty, but because she had become intolerable, because she had dared to outshine those who were born to rule, because she had held the king's heart too tightly, then let it slip through her fingers. And in doing so, she had reminded the court that queens were not ornaments, they were threats. Still, the letter said none of this aloud. It said only what she wanted him to know, that she had been true, that she had been wronged, and that when he remembered her, as she believed he must, she hoped he would not do so with bitterness, but with sorrow. Whether he did is a matter for God. What remains is that folded paper, preserved in shadow, and the knowledge that some letters are not meant to be read, but to be remembered. She was not the first queen to be buried without ceremony, and she would not be the last. But Anne Boleyn died in a way that few queens ever had, with her hands folded gently in prayer and her name erased before her blood dried. She was not embalmed, not mourned in procession, not eulogized in the chapels where kings and queens were usually remembered. She was placed in a crude arrow chest by her ladies, the same hands that had once dressed her in silk and pinned rubies into her dark hair, and they lowered her quietly into the ground beneath the stone floor of St. Peter ad Vincula, a place already heavy, with the bones of forgotten nobles and whispered treasons. There was no cross, no crown, no Latin carved in marble, only her, folded inside herself, head placed beside her body, as if sleep and violence could somehow be made to share the same space. And above her, the tower continued its work, locking, watching, silencing. Jane Seymour was already in Henry's presence by then. She did not ask questions. She did not flinch at the speed of the transition. She knew her role. She was the balm. The contrast. The obedient answer to the Queen who had once dared to debate her husband. She kept her voice soft, her eyes downturned, her words brief. She smiled when summoned and vanished when dismissed. She would give the king a son, and for that, he would forgive her everything, even being the woman who stood where Anne's ghost still lingered. Henry never visited the grave. He never spoke of Anne's last words. He never reread the letter that may or may not have reached him. He never corrected the stories whispered in the years that followed, the ones that said she had been mad, hysterical, corrupt, unfaithful, unnatural. He let those words cling to her legacy like frost. And as the court moved on, her name became dangerous to say. Like a curse or an old wound, no one wished to press. Elizabeth, her daughter, was declared illegitimate, struck from the line of succession, reduced from a Tudor heir to a political inconvenience. A child whose birth once made Henry weep with joy, and now served only to remind him of the wife he had chosen to forget. But Anne did not disappear. Not truly. She lived on in Elizabeth's face. The sharp lines of the jaw, the piercing eyes that missed nothing. She lived on in the child who learned early how to watch without speaking, how to calculate a room without moving, how to outlive expectations simply by refusing to yield. Elizabeth never wept publicly for her mother, but when she finally took the throne more than 2 decades later, she would rule with a memory sharpened by silence. And when she passed through the tower as a prisoner under Queen Mary's reign, she would sleep in the very room where her mother had once written her final letter. They say she wept that night, not for herself, but for the woman who had died folded in linen, surrounded by strangers, still wearing the scent of a marriage turned to steel. As for Thomas Cromwell, he continued his rise. For a while, he built more alliances, crushed more enemies, arranged more marriages. He married his son into the Seymour family, bound himself to the Queen's kin, and was rewarded with wealth and title. But Henry does not forget the hands that do his dirty work. He uses them, then cleans them. And when Cromwell finally fell, it was with the same sudden violence that he had once arranged for Anne. Accused of treason, accused of heresy, no trial, no mercy. The scaffold greeted him too, and they say he died praying for the king. The very man who had once made him powerful enough to destroy a queen. History has many cruelties, but few are as precise as the ones committed in the name of order. Anne Boleyn's death was not madness. It was procedure, a correction, a message. And yet, she haunts, not because she was perfect, but because she refused to be quiet, because she spoke in a court that expected silence, because she rose where others crawled, and dared to demand a crown, not just with her beauty, but with her mind. And so, she was destroyed. But even in her destruction, she left something behind, something that could not be buried in an arrow, chest, or silenced in a courtroom. She left a legacy of defiance, of wit, of a woman who dared to name her desire and walk toward it with eyes open. She died with her hands folded, and the man who sent her to her death never looked back. But history did, and it is still looking, if you listen very carefully, in that soft, suspended space between midnight and morning, when the wind quiets and even your thoughts begin to settle into slower rhythms. You might still hear her Anne Boleyn moving behind the walls of the tower, not as a ghost wailing in chains, but as something deeper and more ancient, something history failed to kill. It is not her footsteps that echo now, but her memory. It defines her unfinished story, The queen who refused to disappear is not buried beneath stone, but curled quietly in the edges of every tale about power, about women who rose too fast, spoke too boldly, loved too openly, and died too soon. She should have been erased. That was the plan. Not just to remove her from the throne, but from the narrative itself. They rewrote the records. They struck her daughter from the line of succession. They whispered of madness, of betrayal, of seduction twisted into sin. Her judge lied. Her husband looked away. Her enemies clinked their goblets when her blood dried on the scaffold floor. And yet, centurilateur, when so many names have turned to dust, hers is still spoken sometimes in reverence, sometimes in curiosity, sometimes with awe. Because Anne Boleyn did something extraordinary, she made herself unforgettable, not through kindness or submission or the quiet virtues expected of queens, but through wit, will-dot, vision, and the kind of brilliance that made powerful men tremble in rooms where she merely entered. She laughed in courtrooms where she was meant to cry. She kissed her daughter's head with the certainty that Elizabeth would one day understand. She folded her hands at the scaffold not as surrender, but as elegance. And when she died, she did not flinch. She did not curse. She did not plead. She simply lifted her chin and let history decide who she had been. And history, though slow, though often written by those who silenced her, remembered Anne, who gave birth not to a son, but to a dynasty. Anne, whose daughter would rise from disgrace and rule for over 4 decades, becoming the most powerful monarch England had ever known. Anne, who taught Elizabeth, without a word, how to survive with silence, how to speak only when the ground was hers to command, how to wear a crown without letting it weigh down the mind. Anne did not vanish. She multiplied in every book, every portrait, every little girl told to stay quiet, who instead chose to question. And so tonight, as the candles burn low and your thoughts begin to float, remember her, not as the queen who lost her head, but as the woman who refused to bow hers. Remember her not for the sword, but for the spark, not for how she died, but for how fiercely she lived. And when the world feels heavy and the voices around you say you are too much, too loud, too ambitious, too difficult, think of Anne Boleyn. Think of the tower. Think of the silence she left behind, and the daughter who shattered it. She was not meant to last, but she did, and now so will you. Sleep well.